How Diseases of Agriculture Impacts History. The Great Hunger, Part 2. The Irish Potato Famine. In terms of agricultural selection of plants for sources of food, both the Old World, including Europe, the Fertile Crescent, and Asia, as well as the New World, North and South America, have contributed to the huge diversity that's available today for people to eat. This took thousands of years for cross-cultural and globalization of various sources of foodstuffs, but over terms of thousands of years, various grasses that include rice, corn, wheat, and barley, beans, tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, squash. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different sources of plants that have been domesticated and used in farming to develop our current modern agriculture. Our ancestors actually often had sometimes better sources of food with what we now call heirloom plants because they had taste and better nutrition compared to some of the sort of mono-agriculture that's predominant today. If we look at different places in the world, we do see that famines throughout human history have occurred for probably thousands of years, maybe not even shortly after agriculture and domestication of plants and animals started to really take root in the human experience. If we take a look at countries like Ireland, Ireland is just an example of where famines were frequently occurring. From 1741 through 1830, famines were almost cyclic or almost predictable. Whenever there was insufficient rain, whether it was too cold, whether it was too hot, crops often failed. It was only the famine of 1741 that was going to become close to the mortality that was eventually to be seen in the mid-1800s. 1741, there were roughly 400,000 who died, out of a total population at the time of about 3.25 million. Prior to 1845, Ireland had become governed by Britain, England in particular, and there was quite a bit of prejudice and repression or oppression of the Irish at that time. British rule over Ireland was brutal. The Irish were not allowed to speak their native language, not allowed to practice their particular faith and practices of religion. They were denied various types of voices in government and governance, and essentially very oppressed and repressed in their native land. They often were not able to afford to own land or prevent it or not allowed to own land, and as such they had to serve as tenant farmers, or what we think of maybe as renting the farmland, and of course had to pay fees to the landlords who actually did own the farms. Farmers were only given a small plot of land, probably, or most likely, at least according to some historic documents. They were given very small areas of land to grow food for their own families, as well as growing enough food to sell to pay for the rents on their property. The soil in that part of Ireland, especially in the west side or west coast, was not suitable for the diverse agriculture that we think of today as providing an adequate or an appropriate diversity of nutritional resources to establish good health. But the area was particularly good at growing potatoes. And eventually, in the western side or western part of Ireland, potatoes did become the sole subsistence food. In particular, one type of potato grew better than others and was a large, somewhat meaty potato called the Irish lumper. Unfortunately, because of its genuine success over other types of potatoes, the Irish lumper established what we'd recognize today as a monoagriculture. Really one vital source of food for the overwhelming majority of the people who lived there. It wasn't unusual for people to eat potatoes morning, noon, and night. It's said, or somewhat recorded, that between a combination of potatoes and some milk, that the Irish at the time had a reasonably good source of protein and nutrition. Though I think most of us today would recognize what they would also be missing could be sources of various vitamins and minerals that we would obtain from a more diverse nutritional diet. About 1/3 of the potatoes that were harvested at that time in the early 19th century were used to feed the livestock. So not only were the humans dependent upon the potato as their source of food, so were their animals. If you couldn't feed the animals, then they could not provide eggs and milk, perhaps, or cheeses that might be used to supplement the sources of food from the potatoes. Early in the 19th century, potato blight started to appear in small geographic areas in both Europe and areas in Great Britain, which would include Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, wherever the potatoes were being grown. And at the time that this blight starts to creep in to the various potato crops, the Irish population, or the population in Ireland, was about 8 million. It had grown significantly within just the past 100 years or so. By the time we get to 1845, the potato blight is firmly established in Western Ireland. And by the time the crop of 1846 emerges, almost all of the potato plants were infected. And once the plant is infected, the root, the tuber, the potato itself, is inedible. It's sometimes thought, well, couldn't you somehow, scavenge some part of the potato to be edible? But they were completely ruined. The British efforts to provide some kind of relief, in retrospect, seem a bit inappropriate, or misled, or certainly not taking into consideration the real need for emergency sources of food and support. And oftentimes, because at that time some in the British government perceived the Irish were inferior people, it was thought they didn't need to be taken care of, and that somehow there would be a balance returned in a natural fashion. Emergency importations of grain failed to prevent any further deaths, often because there weren't any mills available to grind the grain, or there weren't any people well enough to do the grinding, if there were mills. Thousands of peasants that were already starving had no place to live, because since they weren't able to grow the potatoes to use as rent to pay their landlords, the landlords essentially evicted them from their homes. The workhouses and charity homes that were established were poorly managed, or what we would think of today as mismanaged, and there was a fair amount of corruption and inappropriate distribution of resources, so that the poor for whom the resources were supposed to be dedicated never received those sources. And so instead, the workhouses and charity homes became centers of disease and death. By 1847, there's another crop failure, and the farmers in Western Ireland are hit the hardest. On this map, the darkest colors on the left-hand side of the map show areas in Ireland that were essentially starving. They were taking up rations, it says on the map, which means they were looking for outside sources of food to keep them going. Which you can see there are some parts in Western Ireland that almost 100% of those areas needed to have some kind of relief or assistance to provide support to keep those folks alive. On the other parts of Ireland, they had totally different sources of agriculture, and they weren't affected at all, since often they were using grains as their sources of food and their sources of plant materials or crops that they could use to pay rent or to sell and then get some money to buy things. So you can see it's almost split down the middle of this country. To the west, people were starving and dying in the tens of thousands, compared to what was not occurring in the eastern half of the country. And so you could see where some folks might even not believe that the hardships were occurring. The Great Hunger of the Irish Potato Famine forced millions of people to flee the country. By 1851, about 1 million Irish had died of starvation, famine-related diseases, tuberculosis, and cholera. If you reference some of our other discussions, you also realize that in 1831, the disease cholera had been introduced into Great Britain in Edinburgh, Scotland, and eventually was found and spread throughout the whole country. The islands of Great Britain were not spared the effect of cholera in the 1840s. And so, cholera, definitely a problem. Tuberculosis, the White Plague of the 19th century, are both going to take a severe toll on malnourished and starving individuals who are much more susceptible to infection and disease. Millions of people emigrated from Ireland, fleeing the country in search of a better place to live. By 1855, 2 million people had left Ireland for good. They often emigrated to Canada, the United States, Australia, and other countries. Unfortunately, their transit ships that were taking them to their new homes were almost no better than if they had just stayed at home, because the mortality rate on these transit ships was about 40% and became nicknamed coffin ships because of the high mortality. By the time folks had left the country, the population of Ireland had dropped significantly and has never returned to population numbers that had occurred just before the famine developed. Today, the population of Ireland is only 4.85 million. You can easily see that once this famine occurred, this particular country never did recover. And in fact, much has been lost in the century since. This is a map that gives an idea of the population decline between 1841 and 2011. We can see that by 1841, which is just a few years before the famine occurs, on this particular graph, we have about 6.5 million individuals. At the low point, which really is decades after the Irish potato famine, occurs roughly at the time of World War II. There's been a slow, steady increase ever since, but never returning to those pre-famine population days. Many of the Irish who emigrated from Ireland fleeing the famine arrived in the United States. Unfortunately, there was a great deal of discrimination in the United States at the time between Protestants and Catholics. In the U.S., the Irish faced the same kind of discrimination that we see immigrants today facing. The refugees were not welcome, and there was a lot of anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant sentiments among populations in the United States. The Irish did fill most of the menial and dangerous jobs at the time, but they were still targeted with discrimination. Until we get to 1855, in Louisville, Kentucky, one example of discrimination that occurred, it was an election day, and the Protestants did not want their German and Irish Catholic neighbors to be able to vote, even though legally they had a right to vote at that time because they had become American citizens. More than 10,000 citizens packed and left Louisville and never returned. The loss of productivity and money had a dramatic impact on Louisville, Kentucky at the time. It's something that people don't understand and don't seem to take into account. That when everyone is participating and everyone is providing services and taxes and support to their community, whether you like them or not, that helps the whole community. When a particular group of individuals are targeted and they are either killed or leave a town or city or urban area, that has an impact on everyone, and none of it's good. And this is clearly an example of Bloody Monday, August 6, 1855, when we have tens of thousands of individuals who just had been targeted once too many times and decided there must be better places to live. And Louisville, Kentucky really never did regain its prominence in that region that it once had. Often, many of these individuals moved to St. Louis and Chicago, and of course we do know that those cities did benefit from the influx of these additional productive citizens. In terms of the impact of the Irish immigrants turned Irish American in the Civil War, we have the Irish Brigade. Now, the Irish actually were not anti-slavery. In fact, it was very difficult often for some Irish Americans to participate in the Army of the North. In 1861, thousands of Irish and Irish American New Yorkers did enlist in the Union Army. They had quite a few incentives to do so. And 3 all-Irish voluntary infantries were formed and formed the core of what's called the Irish Brigade. The North's largest immigrant group to participate during the Civil War included more than about 150,000 Irishmen. So, a sizable force within the Northern Army. Most of these were individuals who were recent immigrants fleeing the Great Famine, many of whom had not quite yet established their U.S. citizenship, and yet they still joined the Army of the Union to try to reestablish and unite the North and the South. Now, initially, most were participating because they did want to reunify the United States. Their initial participation was not hinging upon anti-slavery sentiments. By the time we get to 1863, there are more than a few what we call draft riots. There was a draft in the Civil War, and unfortunately, some individuals did perceive that the draft was occurring at the benefit of the rich, but to the detriment of the poor, because the rich could essentially purchase roughly $300 a person a replacement for themselves in the armed forces. And of course, who would replace someone who had the funds or the money to do it? So the rich could sit it out, more or less, and the poor would take their place. And of course, the Irish and Irish Americans perceived that they were in that category of the poor who were going to essentially become cannon fodder, and did not particularly appreciate that role within the Northern Army. So we have many outbursts of racist violence, because it's the African Americans who are blamed in some part by some individuals for the occurrence of the Civil War at all. Not that this is an accurate portrayal, but this is how it was perceived at the time by some individuals. Because of this unwanted racist approach by the Irish and Irish Americans, this did mark the end of their participation in the Civil War. By 1864, the Irish Brigade is disbanded for good, in large part because of their negative racist attitude. As it turns out, there were also some Irish and Irish Americans who were anti-slavery and did not agree with some of their former countrymen, and did participate positively in a way that did strengthen the Union, and of course helped to reestablish the Union. Today there are roughly 32 million Americans with predominant Irish roots who do form a strong, participating citizenry, and even to this day are good role models for their family and their community. In the 20th century, scientists tried to figure out which strain of potato blight did cause the Great Potato Famine. And it's now decided that there's a strain of fungi, Phytophthora infestans herb1, or HERB1, that was the cause of that potato blight that destroyed the crops of the mid-19th century in Ireland and Northern Europe. Now, fortunately, there were other strains of potato that were naturally resistant to the infections caused by the HERB1 strain of Phytophthora. And as such, it's thought that today, this particular pathogenic or disease-causing strain of fungi that caused the Great Potato Famine does not exist anymore. At least we certainly hope so. Fortunately for us, we have excellent plant scientists who are constantly monitoring the health and wellness of our agricultural sources of food and making certain that famine and famine-related diseases due to plant blight or other kinds of plant diseases or even animal diseases are kept under control and do not contribute to modern-day famines that still can occur. But today, famines typically occur now because of drought and loss of sources of water for the plants and animals, rather than pathogens that can cause disease in those animals and plants.